Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our session, A Flourishing Future for Forage Fish, Interventions to Support Abundant Fisheries and Thriving Ecosystems. My name is Alex Crofta. I'll be moderating. I'm the Ecological Restoration Projects Manager for Save the Sound in Connecticut and New York. With us today is going to be John Vanderwerf, also from Save the Sound, Kevin Job from the Division of Fisheries with the state of Connecticut, George Jackman with Hudson Riverkeeper, Jeff Yates from Trout Unlimited, and Bill Lucy also with Save the Sound. You can ask questions during the presentation via the chat box, and I will queue those questions up for these presenters. You can also stick around till the very end. We'll have a live Q&A session with these presenters, and they can address any questions you have. Looking forward to hearing from them. I think it's going to be a great presentation, so thanks for tuning in.
Hi, my name is John Vanderwerf, fish biologist with Save the Sound, and I'm here to present a little bit about monitoring forage fish post-dam removal in coastal Connecticut. A little bit of a background and a little bit about why Save the Sound is monitoring is in the winter of 2015 into 2016, Save the Sound completed the Hyde Pond Dam removal in Whitford Brook, Mystic, Connecticut. This project restored over 4.1 miles of migratory fish access and reconnected the river to its floodplains. That very same winter, in February 2016, Save the Sound completed another dam removal on the West River in New Haven, Connecticut, on the Pond Lily Dam. This project restored 2.6 miles of stream and granted Diagonous fish access to 76 acres of ponded habitat. So these are what the sites looked like pre and post removal. On the top, you can see the dams with the spillways, and then on the bottom, you can see where it's a free-flowing river. And these pictures were taken as close to the same spot as possible. So these dams were removed to improve fish habitat and fish passage for alewife, blueback herring, American eel, gizzard shad, American shad, and sea lamprey, all considered forage fish, and also sea-run brook trout. They were also removed to prevent catastrophic dam failure and to reduce the probability of flooding in adjacent neighborhoods. Pond Lily has major apartment buildings and major road immediately adjacent to the property, and Hyde Pond has 2 bridges downstreams which were damaged in a big flood in 2010. So a little bit about how this monitoring works is that in 2017, Save the Sound was awarded funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to support monitoring. It required monitoring for up to 5 years of both sites, and they were both received funding because they were Hurricane Sandy Restoration and Resiliency Fund sites. The monitoring was conducted by Save the Sound and very closely with Connecticut's Deep Fisheries Division. And all of the data collected was compiled by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So a little bit about how the trapping was possible. It was imperative for me to get a scientific collector's permit from the state of Connecticut. It permitted non-lethal trapping with no collection of any fish. All of the fish must have been released upstream immediately of the trap. The traps were coordinated very closely with Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection staff, and there was weekly correspondence between Save the Sound and Connecticut Deep. Also, the traps were checked 6 times a week to keep mortality rate at a minimum. So this is the method. It was a Diagonous fish funnel trap. So as the fish are migrating upstream, they get funneled down into that box where 6 times a week the traps would be checked, and with a dip net you can see in the top picture. So picture and a diagram, see how it's working. So the results in 2020, there was 325 alewives caught at Hyde Pond, 50 alewives caught at Pond Lily. This was a record year for alewives being caught at the Pond Lily site. There were 18 blueback herring caught at Hyde Pond this year, which was a very exciting record year. It was the first time blueback herring were identified upstream of the dam, post-dam removal. There was also 4 American shad, which is the same, the first time they've been documented upstream post-dam removal. There was a sea lamprey this year caught in the trap at Pond Lily, which was also a very exciting surprise in the trap. And the season excitement and the season surprise was 2 striped bass at the Hyde Pond dam removal site. Upstream of that was fascinating. These 2 little under 6-inch striped bass were caught there. And as we were pulling out the pond lily trap, there was an eel wrapped in the mesh, which was the first time we've successfully trapped an eel in one of these traps, so I was very excited about that. So in entirety, there's 349 diagonous fish caught at the Hyde Pond trap this year, and in pond lily there was 52. So it was a record high year for diagonous fish caught at pond lily, and it was a record high year for the biodiversity of the fish run at Hyde Pond. So it was a very exciting fish run this year. So a little bit about, to put these numbers in perspective, the catch per unit effort. So the unit of effort we were measuring was per day, and catch was number of alewives. So there's 325 alewives caught over 74 days, which came out to be 4.4 alewives caught per day. At Pond Lily, 50 alewives were caught over a 67-day period, and that was 0.75 alewives caught per day. Now, these numbers are skewed a little bit low because our methodology accounts for a 2-week window after the last alewife is caught to make sure the entirety of the alewife run is surveyed. So with those 2 weeks of zeros, these numbers skew a little bit low. So for the run, our efficiency, our catch per unit effort efficiency is a little bit higher. Our relative abundance, to give you an idea about how much biodiversity was in the river and how much of the alewives were a factor in that. So the biodiversity of the Hyde Pond, there was 325 alewives caught over 357 total fish, so 91% of that fish run was alewives. Pond Lily, 50 fish alewives were caught over 139 total fish species, so 36% of that West River's fish run was alewives. So a little bit of a lower number, but still an impressive run. So to put all of 2020's data in comparison to years past's data, these dams were removed in 2016. The funding was received in 2017. So in 2017, Hyde Pond, there were no alewives surveyed that year, but there was 3 resident fish species caught. So there were fish utilizing that habitat immediately after. Years following, fascinating, a really interesting year for the dam removal. There was 1,284 alewives caught in the trap upstream of the Hyde Pond dam removal. 3 resident species of fish. So that was an incredible run. We have a couple different hypotheses I would love to discuss after answering some questions. 2019 was a low year with 42, but it was mostly because of high floods kept breaching the trap and ripping the mesh of the trap. So we're sure most of the fish just got right around the trap that year, but we still caught some, 1 resident fish. And then this year there was 325 alewives caught with 349 total diagonous fish of 4 different diagonous fish species, 7 total species, including residents, for 355 fish total caught this year. And Pond Lily, 2017, there was 3 alewives caught immediately after dam removal following year, which was super exciting. And then a total of 3 total species, so 2 resident fish and 5 individual fish for that year. 2018, there's 34 alewives caught, and that was the only diagonous fish that year. There were 5 other species of resident fish for 47 fish in entirety. 2019, 7 alewives were caught with also a gizzard shad that year and a sea lamprey for a total of 3 diagonous fish, 11 species totaled for 110 fish that year. That year was mostly white sucker run. That year was very robust. And this year, 50 fish, record high alewife year for Pond Lily, with also an American eel and the sea lamprey for 3 diagonous fish, 11 total species, and 139 individuals. So the highest per capita run also. It's a very exciting year for that. So what all of this means is that the migratory fish run is highly dynamic. There's a bunch of different numbers each year that are hard to predict. There's countless different influences that play an aspect on when the fish run and how they're running, but there is evidence to suggest that there is an increase in size. The year is generally on an upward trend. You can see that there are more, besides that 1 year in Hyde Pond where the trap was getting ripped out because of flooding. And there also is indications that there's a higher biodiversity each year in the run. But there are many factors that play a role in this. Remnant runs are a major factor. If there aren't a remnant run, if there isn't a historic run of fish running there, there's going to be a hard time getting these fish to continue to run again and again in a year. Also, both of these dams had fish ladders on them prior to dam removal. They were both passing fish. They weren't extremely effective, but they were passing fish. Hyde Ponds eventually got beyond repair, but they did pass fish at one time, so there were remnant runs in these areas that were historic and still relatively recent. They weren't fully extirpated. And also seeding. Seeding is another thing that Kevin Job from Connecticut Deep will touch on and explain a little bit more upon, but that's another useful tool and a useful thing to continue having a robust fishery and a robust fish run each year. But because of all this data and the numbers we're seeing, there is indication that we are having a positive ecological impacts from these dam removals by letting these fish now move freely into the rivers and out of the rivers. We're seeing a higher biodiversity, and we're also seeing higher numbers of fish as well. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kevin Job, and I'm a fisheries biologist with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And today I'm going to talk to you about anadromous alewife population reestablishment in Connecticut, and specifically doing this through transport of pre-spawn adults. So let's jump right into it. A little bit of background on the alewife. They're a small anadromous clupeiid species, anadromous meaning these are the fish that live in the ocean and spawn in freshwater. So in Connecticut and most of southern New England, these fish show up around mid-March depending on water temps. Once the water temps start to hit about 10 degrees Celsius, most of our runs are ramping up. So in the last few years, that's been about mid-March. These fish will come into the systems until about early May. They're going to spawn in the freshwater environment, mostly lakes and ponds. Those eggs will hatch, and the adults they'll leave at that point, and those adults can come back and spawn multiple times. It's called iteroparity. They're not semiparous like a Pacific salmon that dies after spawning. Here in New England, alewives can spawn as much as 3 times, we've seen, and live for about 9 years. So the young of the year have now hatched. They're in the freshwater environment. They're growing. Sometimes about mid-June, the zooplankton populations will start to crash just from so many fish feeding, and a large chunk of the young of the year will actually start to leave. We saw that quite a bit this year. But the remaining fish will be in that area until, as late as November. But those fish, from June through November, you're getting a slow trickle of fish all the time moving down out into the estuary. And once they get to the estuary, their growth really ramps up. At which point they're going to move out into the marine environment, and those fish will be there for 2 to 4 years before they come back to spawn. And as I said, they can spawn multiple times. Obviously, these fish move through all different environments, and they're an extremely important forage fish at all different stages in their life. So they're not a very large fish. At their maximum size are about 12 inches. So from adult all the way through the young of the year stages, these fish are fed on by all sorts of wildlife in the marine environment and the freshwater environment and everywhere in between, especially in that estuary region. So here in Connecticut, we do have a number of threats working against alewives. We have introduced species. A lot of people are surprised to learn that largemouth bass, northern pike, these large freshwater game fish species are introduced. They've been naturalized here for 100 to 150 years. So in this talk today, we're not going to really look at them so much as a threat. They've already been established. This isn't what's causing the population drops we've started documenting since the 1980s. But it's important to note that they're here and they do feed on the adults in freshwater as well as the young of the year while they're growing throughout the season. Pollution, not so much of a problem anymore, but worth mentioning because historically it was. And overfishing, again, not a problem anymore because we have a moratorium on this fishery. What the problems are now are drought. So we've got an increase in droughts. In 2015 and 2016, we suffered some very severe droughts and our populations potentially took a hit, whereas the adults may have been able to get out in the spring where we still had some water. There's a chance those young of the year fish just never got out because the ponds weren't spilling and they didn't spill through into winter. And then our other large problem, this is the largest problem we're going to talk about because it's what do we have control over. Those droughts, we really don't have control. We can hold water for as long as we possibly can and let it go to try and get some fish out. But we're at the mercy of the weather there. Dams, though, this is the big problem here in New England. We have dams. We've got small dams. We've got big dams, mill dams, newer dams for hydroelectric power. There's dams, as you can see, everywhere around the state. And these block these fish from getting up to their natal spawning habitats. So in order to find those spawning habitats, the program years back, this is even before I was born, they went out and they looked all around the state using different sampling techniques, which was whether it was passive basket trapping or going out and just doing visual surveys, looking to see where these runs are happening, active trapping, snorkeling, the idea being the whole state was surveyed. They went out, they identified all the different diagonous fish, specifically looking at those clupeids, so the herring. And in this case, we're going to talk about alewife. So they went out and they identified where these alewife runs remained. And it's important to know where they remain because this is a talk about trucking and reestablishing runs, you don't want to immediately start trucking on top of a population. That population has adapted to be in that system and you want to let them see if they can do it on their own. But it's important to note that there's exceptions. If we give these fish 20 years of safe passage and their numbers keep dropping, we may have to truck in order to save that run. So how do we reconnect habitat? We know we have these dams. The first thing we can do are fishways. So these are Alaskan steep pass fishways, and it's just like any of the fishways that you've seen before. It allows the fish to swim up and over the dam. The pond remains. For whatever reason, we may not have been able to remove that dam, so we use fishways. We also have habitat reconnection. So this was a project we worked on Save the Sound on, and this is at the Bride Brook entrance. This is our largest alewife run in the state with about 400,000 fish. But prior to this horrible culvert on the left-hand side that only allowed fish to pass at certain tides, we went back and worked with Save the Sound and removed the culvert, and now fish can move at almost all tide cycles. And the run went from about 100,000 fish to 400,000 fish in the last decade. And then this is the ultimate when you're trying to reconnect habitat. This is a full dam removal. It's another project we work with Save the Sound on at Hyde Pond in Mystic, Connecticut. And the idea is very simple. You remove the dam, you bring the stream back to the way it was, the fish can swim right through. So again, as I said, the survey data suggests alewives have been extirpated for the system. This is where we really want to start to truck. If a remnant run exists, this is where we're not going to immediately jump into it. We're going to continue to monitor that run. We want to see if they can do it on their own, but if they can't, we may have to start trucking, and we have started trucking, and you'll see an example in here where we have. So how does the trucking project work? Well, historically, fish were taken from the Patagonia River in East Lyme. We've now since moved to Bride Lake in East Lyme. We just have a much larger run there. It's much easier sampling. We have a trap. We can trap those fish. So starting in late March, as I said, they come in, and we only trap and truck until about late April because the water temps get too high. So these fish are taken from the trap, put into the truck, driven all around the state, and we just open a gate and they go into the lake. Again, though, we want those temps to be ideally below 14 degrees Celsius. Above that, I can still truck fish. However, we have to move much smaller numbers or they don't do well in the tank. We have constant circulation in the tank, so the fish continue to swim in a circle. You can see it's a round tank. That way the fish don't get caught in corners. They stay in a school. We add oxygen on our longer trips, and this allows us to move about 1,500 fish at a clip during water temps below 14 degrees Celsius. Once those fish have been stocked, we want to monitor those runs. So we're putting all this time and effort into putting these fish out. The fish spawn, the adults leave, they're never going to return, but those young of the year are now imprinted. They're just like when you think of salmon, they come back to where they want to go. There's some levels of straying. However, when we've put those fish out and they spawn, those young of the year, they're going to come back to where they were stocked. So we need to monitor that. We want to make sure that all that effort is worth it. So we do that with electronic fish counters. The fish swim through a tunnel and it literally just goes 1, 2. And we also use video counting stations where we actually have to go 1, 2. Takes a lot longer, but they're right there. You can see everything in front of you. So a little more background. We're not just starting trucking now. This started prior to 2001, some small scale stuff around the state. In 2002, much larger scale stocking began. And between 2002 and 2016, about 50,000 fish were stocked at a rate of about 3,300 fish per year and about 200 to 400 fish per area stocked. However, unfortunately, we had very limited returns, and we wanted to look into why. So we think maybe it's habitat-based or numbers-based. So first, we went out and identified the most productive rearing locations for juveniles. So the lakes that have a lot of zooplankton, deep, easy access to the ocean. We started identifying those and put those at the top of the list. Then we were like, okay, if the other states are stocking larger numbers. New Hampshire and Maine has, they said to us, hey, we're putting out larger numbers. This is what we're seeing. We decided, okay, let's ramp up our numbers. So instead of doing 200 to 400, we moved to 800 to 5,000, depending on acreage and what we have for habitat there. If it's a deep lake full of zooplankton, we can put more fish into it. There's more rearing habitat available. And then we want to monitor this young of the year production. What's coming out of these systems? What's the health of the juveniles? Is it actually worth putting the effort into the system, or should we move to a better system? So I've got 2 quick examples. I realize I'm running short on time, but let's get into these. So the very first is Mill Brook. This is in Old Lyme, Connecticut. It's had dams on it since the late 1600s, early 1700s. So this was a good one to start on. A small remnant run was below the dam, the lowest dam, which was just above the head of tide. But a fishway was built there in 1998, the next one up in 2000, and the final one in 2013. This connects Rogers Lake, which by Connecticut standards is a large lake. Can probably produce a very good number of fish. We put an electronic fish counter on the first dam in 2002, and we found that though there were initial modest runs, they were between 12 and 15,000 at their peak. They started dropping off with the drop that I explained. Since the 80s, we've had a general dropping of the alewife population. It continued here, and we hit our low point in 2015 and 2016 with only 134 fish in 2015 and 304 fish in 2016. And the decision was basically made, we need to truck Rogers Lake or we may lose this run. And this worked out well because Yale was also working on a project, and we were able to work with them. And they're actually going in and monitoring the presence, abundance, and growth of the young of the year. So we work with them to put all the adults in. In the last 5 years, we've put 16,211 adults pre-spawn into Rogers Lake. They've monitored the spawning, they've monitored the abundance and the growth of those young of the year. And then this year was the first year we really expected, we're going to start getting some real numbers back. And in 2020, we more than doubled the highest rate ever measured at the lowest dam, so where that electronic fish counter is. And we had just about 38,000 fish there this year. And we had the first volitional adults of moving into Rogers Lake. So it's the first time documented adults of alewives, anadromous alewives moving into the lake since the 1700s. And we're going to continue yearly monitoring here. We're expecting this number to continue to grow as we continue to stock, and we'll be stocking here till 2022. Similarly, much smaller system, Fishing Brook. This is in Old Lyme, Connecticut. An Old Saybrook, Connecticut, my apologies. And this was constructed in 2001, small steep pass fishway. There was a small remnant run there. The owner of the property used to net the fish into the pond. We weren't sure how large that run was. After 10 years, we put a camera in to see, what's established for a run there. And it was only 167 fish. So unfortunately, it seems that remnant run was likely smaller than we originally thought. And the decision was made to start trucking this system. So we identified some extremely nice habitat that the fish were not utilizing yet in an old borrow pit. So this is a man-made pond in that drainage, but it's deep and full of zooplankton. So we decided this would be a good place to stock. So between 2016 and 2017, 600 pre-spawn adults were put into this pond. And last year we started monitoring, and we were up to 14,279 fish, up from 167 in 2011. So the stocking appears to be working well there. This year we had 12,000 fish. However, the 2017 stocking was smaller than the 2016 stocking, so we would expect a lower number. Next year we expect a large number as those 2019 fish come back for a second spawn, in addition to the 2021 fish. So what's next? We've identified 22 stocking locations throughout the state. We're going to stock these heavily, as we said, through 2022. And stocking began in 2019. So last year was the first year where we decided to put out these large numbers. In the last 2 years, we've put out over 43,000 fish. So that's more than the previous 15 years combined. And we're going to continue doing this through 2022. If these stockings, in fact, prove to be successful, we're going to continue monitoring, obviously, but we're going to move from those sites onto 10 additional sites that we've also identified, but we're waiting to utilize. So I really appreciate your time. I'm sorry, I realized that was quite quick. It's a lot of information to get into a small spot. Here are a few photos of this spring's runs around the state. You can see some young of the year, some adults moving upstream. It's a very exciting project. I'm really looking forward to getting these estuaries full of this fish again. And thank you so much for your time. Have a good one.
Hi everyone, this is George from Riverkeeper. Today I'm going to talk about the Hudson River, its history, its ecology, and its fishes. So essentially, the Hudson River is one of the great rivers of the United States. It forms the second largest estuary on the east coast of the United States. And in total, the river flows approximately 315 miles. It starts at Mount Marcy and flows until the battery. So, but the tidal portion is now blocked by the federal dam in Troy, and that then it flows for 153 miles from the battery to Troy. So an estuary is where marine waters mix with fresh water, and then water flowing from the tributaries. So the river ebbs and flows with the tidal cycle for those 153 miles. And the native tribes call the Hudson River the Mohican Tuck, the river that flows both ways. So essentially the river is brackish from New York Harbor to Newburgh Bay. I love this picture because it captures what it must have been like when the Native Americans saw Henry Hudson in the half moon sailing up the Hudson River. And his navigator, Robert Jewett, said when the boat was at around the Verrazano Bridge, he said, "The river is full of fish. It is teeming with life." And but what he also said was, when the boat was around where the George Washington Bridge, he said, "This is the finest land my eyes have ever seen. And I could walk dry shod on the backs of the fish, and the birds block out the sky for the minutes at a time." That's somewhat apocryphal, and but is it untrue? Nah, it's what he's trying to say is it forms a baseline. Of course, it's not true, but however, passenger pigeons were around, and they did block out the sky. They were one of the largest biomasses in the United States or North America at the time. So this is our Hudson River estuary. And the sturgeon is our iconic fish of the river. The Hudson River is unstable, and so are many of the fish populations. It's 4 degrees warmer. For a fish, a poikilotherm, that's quite hot. So the Atlantic sturgeon's in danger, the short-nosed sturgeon in danger. Rainbow smelt are no longer found in the Hudson. American shad are now depleted. Alewife are depleted. Blueback herring are depleted. American eels are depleted. Winter flounders depleted. Tomcod, also known as frost fish, are vanishing. They're in significant decline, affected by PCBs. Most of the fish are affected by PCBs, but also the tomcod could be vanishing due to climate change. White catfish, nobody knows why they're really declining. It could be a variety of factors. Same thing for white perch. Striped bass, this is due to overexploitation by anglers. And brook trout, this was mostly due to habitat alteration. And so 95% of their genetically distinct populations have been extirpated. Oysters, at one time, there were about 350 square miles of oyster reefs in the Hudson River and the New York Harbor. They were essentially blown up, over-harvested, and pollution helped destroy them. Thankfully, the Billion Oysters Project, New York City Parks, and New York, New Jersey Baykeeper are trying to change that. Freshwater mussels, they could be one of our most imperiled mussels, freshwater species. They're in significant decline across the country, and it's mostly due to dams and water quality issues. So this was shad fishing in the 20th century. At one time, they would just do a haul seine and haul these nets in, and at one point, there were 50 million pounds of shad caught in the 20th century. Water withdrawals are a big problem on the Hudson River, entrainment and impingement. I believe the Indian Point withdraws 1 billion gallons of water per day, and it's estimated it kills up to 2 billion fish per year. However, that's not for long because Riverkeeper has sued and finally won, and they've decommissioned one of the reactors, and next year they will be decommissioning the other. With these water withdrawals, the suction is so great it impinges fish against that, and some of the juveniles and the eggs get sucked into the machinery, or they're impinged on the screens. This is another problem probably affecting diagonous fish worldwide. Industrial fishing, who's really counting, who's really watching, who's observing with what's in these nets. And what we know is our diagonous fish in our rivers are not recovering despite everything we're trying to do. So this is probably a significant problem, and there could be habitat issues out in the ocean. Diadremy was an amazing evolutionary strategy. These fish would cross the haline barrier or the salt barriers to renew their populations. They did it to protect their offspring from large predators in the ocean. What they did was but by doing so, they mobilized marine-derived nutrients into oligotrophic freshwater systems, and it recharged the systems for their offspring. It was an amazing strategy, but until the last 400 years, because man has altered the habitats, and 80% of the world's settlement is on rivers and coastal areas. So, and we dammed a lot of rivers, and that became and prevented them from entering their spawning habitat or nursery habitat. And they're also overharvested. I love this picture. I took this picture, and it represents to me what river herring are. They're ambassadors to the river, the land, and the sea. And as you can see, they're an integral part of our ecosystems, and even their nutrients help plants grow better. All stages of their offspring help our ecosystems, and so as do their eggs. And so every stage of their life cycle is important to the ecosystem. The problem is they're depleted coastwide, and now the same thing applies to eels. Eels once formed 25% of the biomass in Hudson Valley streams. That's no longer true. Dams block a significant portion of them, and they're in significant decline. So these juveniles, they're catadromous. They're born in the Sargasso Sea, and they head upstream, and they get blocked by these dams. Each dam blocks at least one order, or 90% of the upstream moving the immigrating population, and they have the astonishing ability to climb these dams. They can derive purchase on a textured surface. However, each dam to them is like El Capitan to us. So each glass eel or river herring has to do an amazing feat. They are equivalent to Alex Honnold free soloing El Capitan. He scaled El Capitan in 2017 without ropes. In 2013, a Dutch climber, I think it took him like 4 days, and he did it in 4 hours. But he is an extremely unique human being. So the settlement of the Hudson Valley, there was no power back then. There was no Con Ed, so grist mills were used to grind grain, but the problem is, at one point, things started to change. The Hudson Valley and the rivers, they were a source of power. So we went from these bucolic dams into something more industrial dams. This was the Burden Dam on the Winans Kill. And in New York State, there's about 7,000 dams that we know of. How do dams affect ecosystems? Well, the first thing they do is bisect habitat. They block nutrient flow. They cause increased evaporation. They cause chemical and thermal impairment of the water body. So they affect, but most of all, they block fish from moving, and they create genetic bottlenecks. This picture you could see, was upstream of a dam I took, and this is downstream. As you can see, the water quality is severely impaired. Riverkeeper removed a barrier on the Winans Kill, the first barrier, this barrier right here, right below me. And for 85 years, that barrier stood, and we brokered a deal with Troy and the DEC to remove that barrier. And within 4 days, river herring moved into the Winans Kill to spawn. And that was a historic movement. And that people heard about that around the world, we received communication. But it was the first time in the Hudson Valley that habitat was restored expressly for fish. So I could show you the video, but we don't have time. So many times people often talk about fish ladders and fish hatcheries. In my opinion, they're the false promise. DEC, New York State DEC, will not consider fish ladders in the Hudson River estuary. They would rather remove the dams, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. In my opinion, fish ladders are a failure. What we're asking people, or the fish, to do would be equivalent of asking humans to climb the cables of the George Washington Bridge. I don't know if what we're doing is selecting for boldness. They're species specific, and not every one of the fish can do it. And the last thing we want are bold prey species. I don't know if you could do that. I certainly wouldn't want to climb those gables, and that's what we're asking fish to. We're asking them to perform unnatural requests. Fish hatcheries are another failure. What we lose is genetic diversity and natural selection, and it masks the problems in the habitat. So in my opinion, it was always a false promise. If these things worked, fish ladders and fish hatcheries, we wouldn't be in the problem we are. But obviously, after 100 years, we still haven't resolved the problem. So Riverkeeper has engaged in a movement to remove dams in the Hudson Valley. The problem is in 67 or so of the tributaries to the Hudson, most have natural or artificial barriers preventing movement for fish. But Riverkeeper is determined to remove high priority man-made barriers and returning ancestral habitat. We have 2 dams coming down this year, and we have several other contracts for more, and other organizations it's becoming contagious, and they're removing dams as well. So Riverkeeper is the voice for the voiceless. We speak for the fishes, and we try and protect the fish. And we will not be happy until the fish are recovered. And we look forward to a river teeming with life. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. This is Jeff Yates, the National Director of Volunteer Operations with Trout Unlimited. Really sorry we can't all be together in person this year. Glad you stopped by to hear my session on building a conservation community through science and restoration. When I was 11, my dad and I joined Trout Unlimited. And we joined because we loved fishing. We wanted to learn more about where to go fishing locally. We wanted to meet people who fished. But at the same time that we joined, the state found wild spawning brown trout in the Norwalk River, which is my home river in Wilton, for the first time that I was ever aware of. That changed my mentality and my understanding of what was possible within our local streams. And I very quickly shifted from a consumptive angler to a conservationist who was committed to restoring this river, to seeing these fish return and thrive. And since that time, in the 25 years since, I've seen dams come down on the river. I've seen sea-run fish, including lamprey, herring, and other forage fish, return to the river in significant numbers in the lower reaches, and hopefully soon as we remove more dams in some of the upper reaches. And I've seen the ecosystem rebound because of the impacts that those forage fish have on it. The other thing that I saw bloom along with the river was a community consciousness around cold water conservation, around the importance of cold, clean rivers and streams, healthy watersheds, protected landscapes, dam removals, and this connection between the Long Island Sound and the inland reaches of the Norwalk River, and how these forage fish and these diagonous ecosystems played a critical role in the entire health of the watershed. It didn't happen by accident, though, and that's something I wanted to talk about today. I want to talk about how many of us focus, sometimes almost entirely, on the conservation impacts of our work. We focus on the miles of stream restored. We focus on the numbers of herring and other sea-run fish returning to the rivers. We focus on water quality. We focus on sediment load reductions. We focus on a range of things that help us, in a very resources limited environment, prioritize the work we're doing so that we have the biggest bang for our buck, right? That's the phrase. Too often, and it's true within Trout Unlimited as well, especially among our professional staff, what we leave out of that mix is the community building outcomes that are really critical for the short term, but especially for the long-term success of our work. Let's be frank, all of us are going to be gone sometime in the not so distant future. If we're lucky, we might have a 30 or 40-year career doing the work that we love, and we'll make a significant impact on a river and stream. But we owe it to the rivers and the watersheds and the estuaries that we work in to leave behind an engaged, inspired, and empowered community that keeps driving that work forward. And that's really something that we all need to focus on. Sometimes where that might be one of the primary outcomes that we're driving for, even if it's a project that's focused more on the fish. So you know, we all know the activities that are great for community engagement. Tree plantings that not only help restore rivers, but also allow lots of people to literally get their hands dirty, to plant a tree that they will see time and time again as they walk with their friends, ride bikes with their kids, go bird watching, stop by a local store. We can also do trash cleanups. And some of the fun things about trash cleanups is it's a great way for people to discover rivers they didn't even know about in their community. I can't tell you the number of times that I've heard someone say, gosh, I've lived in town for 30 years and I had no idea this river was here. They drive by it every day, but they don't notice it. They don't see it. Getting them down into the river is a real meaningful connection to that stream. We can engage people with doing science work, whether it's assessing culverts for removal, doing reach assessments, water temperature, water quality measurements, macroinvertebrate sampling. Connecting people to science is a great way to really get deeply engaged and educated people who will learn about how their impacts are impacting the watershed, but also what can be done about it while they're doing the work. Habitat work, removing small dams, restoring in-stream habitat, dealing with storm water runoff through community rain gardens. These are all great projects to engage people in the work that needs to be done. They have a meaningful impact on our work, and they also have a meaningful connection with the people in the communities where these rivers flow. Engaging youth in what I call the stream of engagement, that's TU's term, stands for science, technology, recreation, education, art, and math, is a really, really important part of all of our jobs. We need to leave this next generation with a healthier world, and we need to connect them to the outdoors as much as we can, as many times as we can, so that they, maybe not right away, but will return to it when they are in their 30s and 40s and 50s, as a volunteer, as an advocate, as a donor. We also need to harness new technology, mobile applications, do-it-yourself stream gauges, things that allow common people to feel like scientists, to get out in the field and help do real science that then drives real conservation work. This is an important and probably critical way for us to start engaging millennials and future generations of conservationists. And if we don't pivot and focus on that now, we may lose the opportunity to really connect with a large swath of that demographic. This is also a great time, especially because of COVID, to have fun trying new ways to engage community. This is a Bitmoji classroom presentation I built. That's my dog Tahoe in the lower left. Training our volunteers how to run a digital streamside trash cleanup where there was no contact, no large group gatherings, and learned something new from my wife who's a teacher and tried a Bitmoji. I gotta tell you, the response to this was pretty awesome. It was a really powerful reminder to me that sometimes trying new things can really cascade into opening doors. The number of people who have watched this training video that aren't members of our organization, that aren't anglers, is astounding to me. And the follow-up that I've seen, the photos of the trash they're picking up, really heartens me to the future for our rivers and streams. So all that said, I've got about 2 minutes now. This is a crazy amount of time to condense this into, and I'm happy to answer questions in person anytime you want to reach out to me. I like to think about this as an ecosystems approach to community building. It's just like you would approach how to assess and restore a watershed for forage fish, for diagonous fish, to reopen that passage to the sound, to make sure that there's the right spawning and rearing and refuge, habitat for these fish. It's all critical. You need to think about your communities in the same way. What are the networks that you need to bring to bear? What are the youth groups in your communities? The Boys Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Boys and Girls Clubs. What are the civic groups? The Lions, the Rotary, the Kiwanis Club. What are aligned nonprofits and their members who may not be fish or water people? Land trusts, garden clubs, those types of organizations. Who are the people you can bring to the table? What are the local companies that you can engage in conservation work? When you start really mapping the potential partners that are out there, you can really quickly understand just how much opportunity is out there. And that gets me to the other point. Sometimes you need to make the conservation outcome of your work the secondary outcome goal. Sometimes it's more important to pick a project site that has real meaning to the community where you're trying to work. It could be a public park. It could be a stretch of river that's very visible in a downtown area. It could be a stream that runs by a school, or might run right through a sports complex where the fields are mowed right to the river's edge. Sometimes doing a project that builds community, even if the conservation outcome is not as significant, is the project that helps you open doors in that community for more work to come. It allows you to educate people that the trees they plant are going to help the river and the fish and make an impact all the way out in the ocean. And those are the opportunities that we all need to make happen so that we can continue to grow our work. Without this community behind us, we'll have a hard time sustaining and growing our work. There's too much to be done, and we need all the hands we can get. So invest the time in building community as part of every project that you possibly can. Make sure you're giving people opportunities to get their feet wet, get their hands dirty, and learn how they can make a difference for forage fish and clean rivers and a healthy estuary and ocean through simple actions in their own hometowns. Well, thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Again, always feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be in the presenter's information, but it's jyates@tu.org. I hope to see you all in person next year. Thanks again.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Lucy. I'm the Long Island Soundkeeper. I work with Save the Sound like some of our other presenters. I also am a member of the Waterkeeper Alliance, which is a global organization. I'm here today to talk about protecting forage fish through management and policy. And so we'll start with what are forage fish. It's a good place to start. Here's the official NOAA definition you can read, but it's important to remember that forage fish are any small fish. So striped bass, bluefish, when they're young and small and schooling, they're prey for other fish, other predators that are larger than themselves. One main point here is that they are inherently difficult to manage. Many of these species don't have very good abundance estimates. And the reason for that is several species are not commercially fished, at least not anymore. Typically, when you're looking at herring or menhaden, there's a lot of harvest data. So you can get age and sex and volume and biomass and plug those into fisheries models and figure it out. But with blueback herring, alewives, those need to be specifically counted in what's called independent fishery surveys. And those are typically run by federal grants, state grants, agencies, and they're directed at counting of specific species, and they're expensive. And you have to do this for several years in a row to get any kind of trend analysis to do population estimates. It's also hard with some of these species to tell where they're coming from. So there was a recent paper looking at isotope work, say this was on Manhattan, that showed that the water chemistry where these young fish were born and did the early days of their rearing, it gets incorporated into their otoliths. And during a harvest situation with Manhattan, you can cut that ear bone and you can get an idea of a general region where they're from. Another big point with forage fish is that they are highly susceptible to environmental conditions. This is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. There's a Pacific decadal oscillation as well. And forage fish have zones where they do very well. It's these areas between warm, wet winters and cold, dry winters. This is probably, you know, about the 1970s or so. And here you got a regime shift, and the ocean conditions and the plankton that are in the ocean can change dramatically, either providing abundant food for forage fish or taking it away. So you can get these incredible swings in population. So one thing that we need to do is understand when those swings are going to happen through climate forecasting. There's one paper that suggested that if you reduce your fishing prior to a climate-induced population catch, over the long term of that fishery, you only see a 2% loss instead of an over-harvest situation and then a complete shutdown of the fishery. You also need to know where your runs are, and you need to have the ranges mapped out, and you need to take into account, again, the climate and how that's changing, and also the quality of the habitat. So a lot of these historic rivers, this is alewife and blueback herring, don't have strong runs anymore. This is a picture from Haines, Alaska from last year that a friend sent me, along with some smoked eulachon. There's still very healthy runs of smelt. And you can go down to the river and fill up a 5-gallon bucket in 10 minutes and get all the smolt you need to smelt that you need to smoke for the year. So we used to have that abundant. You talk to the old timers, we used to have that abundance in Long Island Sound. We don't anymore. I'll show you a graph in a little bit of the population of a couple of these species. So what we do have, though, are two efforts going on in New York and Connecticut to try and track this abundance. The first is with Connecticut Deep, Steve Gephardt, our fisheries guru here for anadromous fish. He sends out a weekly summary that has all the different numbers from each of the fish passages in any place where people are counting alewives and blueback herring and other species. And on the New York side, Vicki O'Neill with DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, along with the CTUC org, a nonprofit, have a great network of citizen scientists who count the rivers. They go to specific spots. And we actually, one of these folks working in Westchester with us saw the first alewife in the Hutchinson River this last year. And there's a place where there's a dam that's going to be removed. So there may be a remnant run in there that will benefit from that habitat alteration. Where I come into play is lobbying. So there are different legislative efforts that are looking at trying to enhance management of forage fish. A big one right now being championed by Senator Blumenthal is HR 2236, the Forage Fish Conservation Act. Here's some of the other folks that are interested in getting involved in it. This would direct the National Fishery Management Councils. There's 8 of these under the Magnuson-Stevenson Act that have been designated. And they've done a great job of bringing a lot of our runs and different populations back from overfish status. But there needs to be increased effort on some of these smaller forage fish, the river herring, anchovies, those sorts of small unfished populations. And this is the reason why. If you look at American shad and river herring back when they were commercially landed, back in the 50s when this data set started, there was a tremendous amount. These are millions of pounds, 8-10 million pounds of shad landings. They dropped off. Here's a big precipitous decline in this section. Here you look at the 1977 regime shift. You see a drop off there and then a rebound with the shad, and then they've dropped off as well. What we've noticed here since that change, the river herring landings have not recovered. And in a response to that, another policy issue is being challenged by the Natural Resource Defense Council, which filed a lawsuit on May 4th against the National Marine Fisheries Service, determination that river herring, specifically blueback herring, are not going to be listed under the endangered species, which would require extra care in trying to restore their critical habitat and other protective measures. So we don't know what's going to happen with this, but basically what they're saying in this lawsuit is that you need to account for climate change. If you go back to those range maps and think about it, if their range is contracting due to environmental conditions induced by climate change, we're going to need to think about how we want to restore those populations. And one of the best ways that I think this can occur is through this concept of ecosystem-based fisheries management. There's 4 tiers. This is from NOAA Fishery. Ecosystem-based management looks at all the stakeholders involved, anyone who would have an effect on the fish populations. Ecosystem-based fisheries management is looking at composite stocks. So not just single stock fish, which is down here. This is our traditional method, single species management, where you have a species, let's say striped bass, you have 100 striped bass, you're allowed to harvest, say 20, 40%, and then you leave the rest in the water to spawn to rebuild the population and keep it at a sustainable level. What ecosystem-based fisheries management does is it looks at how each of these species interact with each other. Also how they interact with climate, the habitat conditions, and the populations of the predator species. So this was just passed in August of 2020, this concept of ecological-based fisheries management using what are termed ecological reference points. In August 2020 by Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission. It's a peer-reviewed model, been working on it for 10 years, and it looks at these species here, Manhattan, Atlantic herring, spiny dogfish, striped bass, bluefish, and weakfish, and how they all, their populations correlate to each other. This next chart here shows the outputs of example ecological reference points. Right here, it's a 0.19. That's the target to fish at. So if you're fishing at basically 20% of the biomass, that would create a situation that is sustainable. Now, right now, the fisheries that's being promulgated fish below this. I think they're at 0.16, 0.17 last year, the main fishery for Manhattan. So they're well below this line. And this was decided because there's some population issues with some of the other species I mentioned, specifically striped bass. Now, striped bass and bluefish and weakfish, all those are doing great. Their populations are well. This model says you can fish over a third of the Manhattan biomass, and you won't have you'll have a sustainable fishery, and you won't be affecting other populations. What we also need to do is continue to pass management decisions that protect the spawning and migration corridors. This happened back in 2018. The New England Fishery Management Council voted this buffer zone here, which closes the coastline of New England to trawling for Atlantic herring. And what that does for Long Island Sound is the bluebacks and alewives congregate here before they run into the Connecticut rivers. And we took out a lot of the trawling effort in here while these fish were staging to run up our river. So we should see a response of the population because of that. And then finally, we need to, and there's going to be other discussions on this, we need to enhance the habitat. So we need to remove the dams. One of our projects, Brides Brook, now has a run. I think this year was 408,000 alewives from a very small population. So we do have evidence that if we do these types of habitat manipulations, we can really increase our forage fish and hopefully have them around for the future. So thank you very much, and I'll stop that, and it's time for questions.
Hi, everyone. Hey, Jeff. Hey, Bill, George, and John and Kevin, I think, are coming in any second now. Thanks for those great presentations, everybody, and thanks for joining us for a question and answer session here. Again, folks in the audience, if you have any questions, go ahead and fire away in the chat box, and I'll filter those through to the presenters here. So I'm going to start with a question from April Richards, and this might be most relevant to you, Kevin, because it deals with zooplankton. Are you seeing changes in zooplankton populations over time as you measure declines in alewife populations? I know you said you had some zooplankton as part of your work as well.
Yes, we work with Yale University. They're going out and checking places where we're actually going out and trucking these fish to, and they're actually doing these zooplankton tows to look and see how the fish that are currently there are affecting the populations. And we can actually see, as those fish grow, the population of the zooplankton, the larger zooplankton that the fish can feed on, actually go down over time. And that's when we can see that those fish start emigrating out of the system when the large zooplankton are gone. I say large zooplankton because in lakes where we have landlocked alewives, so alewives become landlocked in some of the lakes in Connecticut. Those landlocked alewives have actually, they've evolved to have smaller gill rakers. They can actually feed on smaller zooplankton than the anadromous alewives in that system. So Yale's looking at those. They want to see how the anadromous fish and the landlocked fish interact. We currently are not doing zooplankton tows now. We just don't have crew size to do it or the funding to do it. So that's what we're working with now. Seeing those systems pre-alewife, I haven't done in Connecticut, but I have done some in Maine. And when the alewives are not present, you have extremely large rotifers and cladosternons. You have these large zooplankton in a very robust population. When the fish get reintroduced, you do see the population come down. But as I said, what happens is those juveniles will leave when those large zooplankton populations drop. And then as those fish leave, the zooplankton go through a cycle where they come back again. So if you were to come back in the spring and sample again, you're seeing those large zooplankton have returned. I hope that answers that. We were just looking to see where do we have a lot of food for these fish and what kind of lakes. So working with Yale, we identified what lakes in the area have these large zooplankton populations and where is a very likely source of success when we stock these fish.
Gotcha. Thanks, Kevin. I had a couple questions here for Jeff. One, Jeff, could you provide a link to your digital streetside trash cleanup training video? I'm not sure how we could do that through this.
I'll chat. I'll send everybody. Can you hear me first of all? Because I just okay. I'll chat everybody. So I assume that's all entire audience.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff.
I'll send you our Vimeo channel. So,
Sweet.
yeah.
And then there was one other quick question for you, Jeff. Trout Unlimited being a freshwater-focused organization, how do you recommend coastal-based restoration organizations connect with organizations like yours, recognizing, of course, that the systems are all connected?
Absolutely. I think probably, the biggest thing, first of all, with our group, is we're primarily made of anglers. So chances are, if you're working on a system that connects to an estuary, a good percentage of the most active volunteers in that local TU chapter are also going to be saltwater anglers and already be there right with you. They just don't understand the nexus between the freshwater and saltwater interface and making that getting in front of them. Honestly, well, COVID makes it a little tough, but I'm a huge fan of just going and speaking to these groups. I can't tell you how many of these organizations you know, have guest speakers and things like that. And you have to invest the time in building those relationships. Don't make them come to you. Don't make them come to your, you know, fish count festival or your trash event. Go to them. You know, go to those land trusts, go to those Trout Unlimited groups, go to the Audubon, you know, gatherings, be a speaker there. That's generally where I find you're going to find the like-minded people who are pretty easy to convert to be Forage Fish fans. So
Great, thanks. This is probably a question for you, Bill, from Bob Houston. Forage fish are an important source of food for many species of seabirds, including terns, puffins, and razorbills. How are seabirds included in ecosystem-based fishery management? Who speaks for the birds on the New England Fishery Management Council? Oh, hey, Bill, I think you're still muted. I don't know why I said that louder, like it would help. Hey, Bill? Can't hear you. Yeah, I can't hear you, Bill. That's all right. We can jump to another question and pipe in if you do get sound there. Had a question for you, George. You mentioned that dams can create genetic barriers. Can you say a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, if fish populations get trapped between barriers, what that means is you get a genetic isolation. Genetic isolation would be like an inbreeding. So it would be like inbreeding with humans. So it can cause genetic problems down the line. And as a matter of fact, DEC is now starting to look at genetic issues or evolutionary issues with dams and fish populations. And you could look at relatedness amongst
that's a great question. First off, can you hear me?
Yeah, but you could look at relatedness within fish populations trapped between dams. So
Okay.
It's very relevant.
Gotcha,
Am I
thanks.
muted?
Hey, Bill?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you now. There seems like a little delay, but we can hear you.
It says I'm not muted. Let's see.
try turning your video off, Bill,
Thanks, Jeff.
and keep talking. No.
No, sorry, Bill. If we get you back, we'll try to cover that question. Had another question, maybe Kevin, or this might be a question for Kevin or Bill if he gets back in. Is anyone looking into estuarine resident forage species like mummy chug, striped killifish, or other similar species in the Sound area?
I'm currently not. I know there is or at least was a graduate student. I believe they've just finished up who are looking into that. But I'm strictly dealing with the migratory fish at the moment. There may be somebody with inland who did a little bit with that, and we do have a coastal survey that also may come into play with that, but I don't have any of that data on hand for you. I apologize.
Okay. So
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, Bill.
Okay. Okay, well, that's a great question about the birds. I talked to a caretaker out on Little Gull Island, and can you hear me now?
Yep.
Are you there? Are you there?
Yeah, we can hear you, Bill.
Uh-oh.
We hear you, Bill. Well, we'll see if Bill plugs back in here. Kevin, I had a question for you actually about choosing locations, choosing habitat for stocking. Like what sort of water bodies do you seek out when you're looking to do a stocking?
Yeah, so as I kind of said before, when we're going in and trucking these systems, we're trying to look for places that don't have a remnant run. So we'll potentially go back into the historic record. But if we don't have a historic record for an area having fish,
I can hear now. Okay, so I talked with a character on Little Island a couple years ago. There was a complete failure of the sand lance run, and there was complete nesting failure within the terns as well. So the forage fish are very important. Yeah, you do. Uh-oh, can you hear me now?
Bill, I think we're getting a bad delay on your end.
Okay, how about now?
Now is good. Try one more time.
Okay, there's a big delay, but there is a move right now. Fish are not included in the ecosystem-based fisheries management, but there have been some studies. There's a relationship between herring, Atlantic cod, Atlantic herring, and shorebirds, and that was done over in Europe. And the herring control the cod control the herring. The seabirds benefit based on the different aspects of that trophic relationship. So some of the basic science is getting figured out. So I think in the future of ecosystem-based management, we're going to see a lot more bird species included in those formulations.
Great, we got that all loud and clear. Thank you, Bill. John, I wanted to ask you, so you've seen a lot of variability sort of year to year in the monitoring that you've done. Some of that's been touched on by in Bill's presentation, but I was wondering if there was, if you had any observations on your end from doing work in the field as to why we're seeing such wide swings in the same systems from year to year.
From anecdotal field evidence, one of the major driving factors I'm seeing is flooding events and water temperature. So whenever there's cool water under around 11 degrees, we start seeing more fish moving in and out of or into the rivers. And besides that, any real anecdotal evidence I have is mostly just flows and water temperature based.
Gotcha.
I think one of the things we're going to see
I could.
Go ahead. Briefly, that I think one of the things we're going to see with where John's sampling, this is we'll just say for Pond Lily and Hyde Pond as well. We had a remnant run at both of those locations, and I think what we have to remember is the run that sits below those two sites is they were both extremely small. We monitored Hyde Pond for 2 decades, and there was never a time when we went down there below that dam, looked down, and saw masses of fish like we see in our more prominent runs. So looking at the variability that John saw, one year we had 1,400 fish at Hyde, then the next year we had 40-something fish. There's a group of fish there that's utilized the upper end of the estuary that headed tide right to the dam pretty much. So what you're seeing there is likely, that remnant run on that given year, whether they had better flows, whether they had, like John said, it was temperature related, it's likely that we just saw a big push of that small remnant run. And until that population starts utilizing the newly opened habitat and starts building, it's going to be a while. And like with Hyde, we're not going to truck that system. So until those fish can get up and find some of the small ponds that are up there now and the small wetland areas, until they start utilizing that, the drive to really go up there might not be there. They've been utilizing the upper end of the Mystic River, which they can. The salinities they're not too high there. So I think that might be one of the things to take into account when we're looking at that variability, where we're not actively trucking and expecting to see, in 4 years, a big spike of fish.
Gotcha. Thanks.
1 minute. Yeah.
Okay, we got 1 quick minute. Maybe George, I'll put this question to you. How do you think we transition from dam removal following disasters to preemptive removal, focusing on the restoration of natural water flows?
Could you repeat that again?
Yep. We just got a minute here. Just maybe it's more a question for all of us with just a minute left. Just how do we think about transitioning from dam removals following disasters to preemptive removal, focusing on the restoration of natural flows? I guess we're thinking more about restoration for habitat as opposed to fixing, dams once they're already coming down due to a storm event or something of that
Well, I
nature?
can tell you, we have as a matter of fact, this Friday, we have a Trees for Tribs planting event in an impoundment. The dam naturally breached. And so it's undercut by the stream. And so we will remove the dam at some point, but at this point, what we're trying to do is restore the impoundment and cool off the waters and shade it out and add as much trees in there to stabilize the new naturalized channel and stabilize the sediments. So, that's a way that we're looking to mitigate any of these things.
Awesome. Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. Looks like we've hit our time here. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Reach out to these presenters. We have other extra questions that weren't answered, and thanks a lot.
Thank you. See you, Bill.
See ya.